I first met Fred Johnson in September 1969 when I attended the South Side training school at Waterloo to learn the Type 3 1550 horsepower Crompton diesel electric class locomotives. Fred was an acting instructor at that time and was booked to take us for the first 3 weeks of the 6-week course. This was the second traction course that I'd attended as past second man that year, the first being an electric traction course which I'd passed on the 15th of May. Another nice element was that Bill Tickner, a fellow driver from Woking, was also on the course with me, and Bill was great company. Fred was an excellent instructor and we got on very well, and he probably planted the seed in my mind to become an instructor myself in later years. Fred had a photographic memory and his knowledge of traction and rules was incredible, and whatever question you might ask he'd answer, "What do you want to know?" We had a great time on the course, and unfortunately I didn't get to meet up with him again until I joined the training school myself as an acting instructor in 1987. To give you an idea of Fred's incredible knowledge and versatility, I've compiled a list of types of traction that Fred taught, and this was apart from other duties he conducted at the training school. Fred left school at Christmas 1945, aged 14, and made inquiries to obtain work at the Southern Railway Motor Power Depot at Cherry Orchard Lane, Salisbury, but was informed that they had no vacancies for his age group at present and to come back when he was 16 years of age. Fred applied again in 1948 and entered service as a cleaner in the footplate line of promotion on the 15th of March of that year. Duty commenced at 6 a.m. and finished at 2 p.m. He was given a brass disc, number 30, when signing on, and this was handed back in daily at the end of his duty at the timekeeper's window. Fred and 2 other younger cleaners were shown around by the chargeman cleaner, drawing their attention to various notices that they had to read. They were then taken to the stores department and issued with overalls, cap and a serge coat. They were then shown the cleaning system, where a mixture of paraffin and oil was used to clean the dirt from locomotives and afterwards shone with clean cloths. This demonstration lasted about 20 minutes, just to show them the ropes. There were about 10 lads, most too young for firemen's duties, and as the others had been cleaning the locomotive before they arrived, it was nearly finished. The locomotive was N15 King Arthur class, number 451, Sir Lamorak. After breakfast they started cleaning again. 2 more locomotives, S15 class number 831, a black goods engine, and what was called a channel packet, number 21C1. They had some wheeled steps with a platform on it, which they would push alongside as the air smooth casing on the locomotive was quite high. A fireman came out to fill the sandboxes, and on the side Fred was cleaning, he checked 2 traps to ascertain the level of sand. The fireman's name was Ray Mills, and he said to Fred, "Can you fill them for me?" and handed him the sand filler. Fred took the sand filler from him and filled the sandboxes on the side he was working on. Years later they laughed about this, as Ray moved away to get his driver's job and then became head of the South Side training school at Waterloo. That was Fred's first day finished, and before they washed up they were issued with a new white cloth and soap for the job. At 2 p.m. they all handed their discs back into the timekeeper and went home. During the rest of the week they gradually got used to the job and on average cleaned 2 to 3 locomotives daily, and they had to be clean as the boss man would check them and was quite precise. Some days they would just clean 2 channel packets, and other days it would be a King Arthur, a black motor and a drum and tank. Some of the other locomotives Fred helped clean were King Arthur class number 450 Sir Kay and number 454 Queen Guinevere, T9 class 702 and 706, S15 class 827, 700 class 691, M7 class 127 and 41, and various other channel packets. During Fred's second week at work, the charge hand cleaner told him that he'd had another job, and this was to help the firelighters and steam raisers, as he would soon be learning a fireman's duties. So on the Wednesday and Thursday, Fred worked with Percy Pitman, who showed him how to use a long deep bucket-like shovel, which he'd fill with hot coals from a furnace and light up engines as required, gradually building up the fire with more coal to produce a head of steam prior to the locomotive's preparation. Once the locomotive had enough steam, he'd show Fred how to operate the various types of injectors to put water into the boiler. On this day, he received his first payslip of £2 7 shillings and twopence, and they collected their money on the Friday from the paymaster, who had a hatch situated in the shedmaster's office. On Fred's third week, he was sent out to learn fireman's duties, as what they called the third man. Fred worked 2 days on the West Yard freight shunter engine, number 3441, an Adams 0395 class, that was later renumbered 30577. The driver was Charlie Wakeham and the fireman was Ken Hurst. The shunting performed were trains that came in and were remarshalled for Templecombe, Yeovil and Exeter. The next 2 days were spent on the East Yard carriage shunter, a Drummond M7 tank, number 674, with driver Sid Searle and his mate past fireman Alf Smith. On this turn they would make freight shunts to the Market branch with a few wagons from East Freight Yard. To finish off the week, Fred worked 2 days on the East Yard, freight shunting on Z-class tank engine number 957, the driver being Bert Norris and fireman Red Hulland. This was the busiest yard for shunting work, as they dealt with coal trains from the southern region and western region. The fireman's work was easy, as the trains were pulled up towards Fisherton Tunnel and then fly shunted into different roads. On week 4, Fred was sent out learning firing duties, which consisted of locomotive preparation and disposal duties, and short train running duties to Basingstoke and Templecombe with freight trains, and a 3-coach passenger and van train. All the firemen showed him the ropes and then let him get on with it, and he learnt quite a lot, as they had quite a selection of locomotive types over the week. H15 class, G16 class, U class, S15 class, 700 class, N class, T9 class, S15 class, and on 2 occasions King Arthur class number 450 Sir K, which he'd helped clean on his first week. On week 5, Fred was now classed as a pass cleaner and available for fireman's duties. He was told to keep his eye out on the daily alteration sheet, and on the Wednesday 14th of April he was booked out on his first firing turn on the West End carriage shunter with driver Ted Bolt, the early turn. They sorted out vans and coaches under the carriage shunter's instructions, attaching and detaching from various trains. On week 6, Fred's name was put on the main roster in the West Yard's freight shunting link with driver Ern Stratton. The regular locomotive on this turn was 0395 class number 3441. The main shunting neck ran level with Churchfields Road to the stop block roughly in line with number 1 Shed Road in the depot. On the early turn they took the locomotive into the depot pit road and cleaned the fire. Ern, the driver, said to only clean out the smoke box and ashpan every other day. They would then take coal and replenish the tender with water. The link was a steady job, and Fred stayed in it for 9 weeks. Extra pay was awarded when they were on nights, and wages were now £6 to £7 per week, less tax of course. Fred didn't keep any records of pay rates, but appears from the pay slip for week ending 8th of May 1948 that it was 103 shillings per week. The links of drivers and firemen at this time, from the bottom to top links, were shed turners, restricted drivers and firemen, pit duties, West Yard freight shunter, East Yard freight shunter, East and West Yard carriage shunter, Milford goods, Bulford link, Basingstoke and Templecombe link, Junior Holiday Relief and Spare link, Stone Train link, Portsmouth link, Heavy goods link, Mixed Traction number 2 link, Senior Holiday Relief and Spare link, Mixed Traction number 1 link, main line link. These links were line of promotion links. The number of turns in each link was not consistent and varied between 12 to 20 turns, and around this time there were 140 pairs of men, drivers and firemen, at the depot. They also had an allocation of 80 plus locomotives. Fred moved up to other links as and when moves became available, mostly because of younger firemen leaving because they didn't like the shift work. In the carriage shunting link, he was booked along with driver A. Morrish, and everyone called him Bud. He always wore a soft top hat, similar to the ones that guards wore. He was a very interesting character and told Fred a lot of stories of years gone by. He was quite a small man, and Fred has documented in a number of previous books that because of his stature, he was tasked to crawl through the window of the L12 class locomotive to check on the driver and fireman after the boat train disaster that occurred at Salisbury on Sunday the 1st of July 1906. Both driver Robbins and fireman Gadd were killed in the crash, and there is a plaque in Salisbury Cathedral in memory of this event. As time went by, Fred progressed into the Milford link for 18 weeks with driver Sam Shergold, who was a Wilton man and had been mayor of the town. There was a fairly busy yard and goods shed at Milford, and Adams tank engines numbers 272 to 276 were utilised to work trips from the East Yard to Milford and return, some trains consisting of 40 to 50 wagons. All of the goods for the town were unloaded in the goods shed and delivered around the district. Other goods were also loaded there to be transported to other stations. It was during this period of being in the Milford goods link that Fred had completed 26 weeks service and was appointed as a fireman at Salisbury. This was done automatically if they hadn't already applied to move to another depot. Fred mentioned at this stage that he'd been logged that on 2 occasions he was taken off his rostered turn of duty to work the Bulford branch passenger service and return. Both these trips were with driver Arthur Pointing, and the locomotive was M7 class number 675 and number 127, hauling 2 coaches. Number 127 had all the mod cons of the day, having a steam reverser, and on one of the turns they did 3 trips to Bulford and return. The line branched off the up line at Amesbury Junction with a left-hand diversion. The stations were then Newton Toney, Amesbury and Bulford, although the goods line went onto the Sling. On the return journey, it was all double track. You came under the main line at Amesbury Junction, through a chalk cutting behind the signal box situated on the downside, and out onto the down main line. They would leave Salisbury chimney leading, run round at Bulford returning bunker first. On the 28th of May 1950, Fred moved up to the Basingstoke and Templeton link, his driver being Percy Elston. This is why the Bulford link has had a mention, as he jumped over this link, probably because a number of more senior firemen either left the job or moved to drivers' positions at other depots. This link had a variety of short running turns, preparation and disposal duties with some nights and very early turns. They had only one spare turn starting at 2 AM and another where they booked on at 12:05 AM spare. If all was quiet, you could bet the foreman would come into the cabin and give you a job to go out and clean the tubes on a locomotive, which if in steam was a lousy job. On the 5:45 AM turn, they would book on and dispose of one engine and then prepare another, and after a break walk to the East Yard and work the 9:40 AM Basingstoke freight as far as Andover, shunting en route at Porton, Greatley and Andover before getting relief. On one of the late turns, they signed on at 4:29 PM to work the 4:54 PM passenger service to Templeton with engine number 1795, a U-class, and a 3-coach set. They then detached at Templeton and went over to the up yard and did some freight shunting. This was a busy place as trains also came in from the Somerset and Dorset Railway, the S&D. They then changed over with the Yeovilmen and worked back to Salisbury East Yard with S15 class number 831, and upon completion went light engine to the depot and finish. On the 12th of September they signed on at 9:18 PM, prepared the locomotive, Fred's records show that it was a T14 class, number 461, and his driver Percy Elston called it a paddle boat. It was a 9 Elms engine, as at other times they had anything on the turn, even a Nelson or a Schools. How it came down to Salisbury, Fred doesn't know, but it must be remembered that at this time all engines were detached at Salisbury and went to shed, and fresh engines took on from Salisbury. It wasn't until later years that engines went through from Waterloo to Exeter and vice versa. Their duty was to work the 10:48 p.m. milk train up to Basingstoke, where they were relieved by 9 Elms men. They then had their break at Basingstoke depot mess room and listened to the other drivers and firemen's moans and glories. When the foreman informed them that their down train was about due, they would walk over to relieve Felton men, and after putting some wagons off in the down yard would work the train back to Salisbury. When they got through Hurstbourne and down through Enham Bank, Fred got the fire as right as he could with a boiler full of water, ready for the climb up the bank from Andover to Greatley. Percy had a favourite saying, "All, then nothing," but Fred never worried. Many times they plodded through Greatley back on 120 pound of steam and half a glass of water, and Percy would say, "Ah then, add on 60 wagons at £2 of steam per wagon, and then laugh." Of course, once they were over the top, they were okay, and Fred tried to keep a nice fire down one side for the disposal men at the depot. They would then run down the main line past the depot and propel the train back into West Yard. The engine was then detached, and they'd take her into the shed and leave her secured on the South Side pit road. Fred remained in this link with Percy until the 13th of April 1950, when he was then called up for his national service for the next 2 years. 25th of November 1953. Driver Ted Trickett, fireman Fred Johnson and guard Frank Harding, known as General. On duty 7:55 p.m, locomotive already prepared, Battle of Britain class number 3468 Kenley. Off shed at 8:10 p.m. and booked to work the stone train empties as far as Sidmouth Junction, which is en route to Meldon Quarry. The starting point of the train always varied. Sometimes it would leave from Salisbury West Yard, Dinton, Wilton South or even Tisbury, and would be detailed on the alteration sheet. This particular evening the train was to start at Dinton, so they went light engine to Dinton, the guard, General, normally catching a passenger train there. However, they had a message from the foreman to pick him up at the West Yard Shunters cabin. Away they went, and as they reached Dinton down sidings, they dropped General off by the brake van and went over the ground signal in the station. Once back on the train, Fred coupled up using the screw coupling and connected the vacuum pipes. Ted created the vacuum and the General tested the brake. He then came up and gave Ted the load details: 22 large hoppers and a brake van, fully fitted brake. These hoppers were of the large deep type, sea cows, and were 40 tons when loaded. Thankfully, they were all empty. General walked back to his van, and when the ground signal cleared, off they went, with Fred exchanging hand signals with the guard. General always gave the correct hand signal. Green light swung side to side, and Fred acknowledged this with a white light held steady. This was a decent turn, and with the gradient rising to Semley, all Fred needed to do was to fire to the back corners occasionally and keep 3/4 of a glass of water in the boiler. It was downhill to Gillingham, a slight rise towards the tunnel, and downhill again to Templecombe. The gradient rose again to Milburn Port, and then down Sherborne Bank and levelled out to Yeovil Junction. They stopped at the end of the platform and topped up the tender with water, as they had a few minutes to spare, making a can of tea before setting off again. As they approached Sutton Bingham, the wind had increased and it was blowing quite a gale. Ted said to Fred, "This train seemed to be pulling a bit heavier to me," and reckoned it was probably due to the wind getting into the deep wagons, making them act as a drag. They continued on towards Crewkerne, and it was a fair climb up the incline towards Crewkerne Tunnel. It was now starting to drizzle with rain, but they were still going along nicely enough. They went through Chard, and as usual, Fred kept a reasonable fire until Axminster. However, passing through Axminster, the locomotive started to slip, so Ted eased the regulator and reopened it so the locomotive could find her feet. In the meantime, Fred operated the steam sand lever, but didn't know if this did any good or not. As they were passing Seaton Junction, the locomotive started slipping again and got into a right dance. Slip, 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 with Ted opening and closing the regulator each time to try to arrest the situation. Their speed got slower and slower, and eventually they came to a complete stop. Ted applied the vacuum brake fully, and that was it. They'd come to a rest at a well-known location, Snob's Corner, and Seaton signal box was closed out behind them. Time for action, and Fred said to Ted he would go back and see the guard. They would have to part some of the wagons and take them forward to Honiton Incline signal box, which had a siding, leave them and come back for the rest. Fred said that he would also get a wrong line order form from the guard. This they agreed, and Fred went back to see General and parted the train behind the 10th wagon, leaving 12 wagons and a brake van. General filled in the wrong line order form, which Fred pocketed, and General placed some detonators down to protect the rear of his train. When Fred returned to the locomotive, Ted proceeded without any problems with the 10 wagons, and as there were catch points on the down line, when they reached them, Fred placed a lamp there as a guide for their return journey to collect the rear portion. It was just over 2 miles to the incline signal box, and Ted dropped Fred off to inform the signalman what they intended to do. Fred gave the signalman the wrong line order form, and he then let them shunt the front portion back into the sidings, where Fred secured them with their handbrakes before uncoupling the locomotive. After receiving the tip from the signalman, they then came out on the sidings and dropped back to return to the rear portion of their train. Not forgetting the catch points, and guided by the lamp that Fred had left there, Fred guided Ted over them safely and dropped back onto the rear part of the train. Fred didn't know if General had left the detonators he placed behind the train or not, but as soon as they coupled up and got the tip from the General, they were on their way. The drizzly rain had now ceased, and it didn't seem as windly as before. Ted got them going and they climbed up the bank with ease, and it was about 9 miles to go to Sidmouth Junction. They went up past Incline signal box and through Honiton Tunnel, where it became all downhill running. Ted was quite pleased as they were only running about 16 minutes late, and usually they got to Sidmouth before their return train arrived. This time they didn't have to wait, as it was already standing there. They changed over crews and were soon on their way. Their locomotive was H15 class number 30334, and their load was 10 loaded stone wagons and brake van, 10 equals 421 tonnes. Fred liked these locomotives, and he knew Ted also liked them. They were known as city breeds. They were also called Cathedral class, and 6 of them were allocated to Salisbury Depot. Ted got the train going, and as they were going uphill towards Honiton Tunnel, Ted said, "What's the system today then?" And Fred replied, "Over the half-door firing." The locomotive was steaming well, plenty of water in the boiler as they ran down through Seaton Junction and then Axminster with a steady pull up to the Yeovil Junction. They arrived at Yeovil Junction right on time, took water and made the usual tea brew, and Fred saw Ted take a good look at the fire. Ted then said to Fred, "Right, over here." So Fred took over the driving whilst Ted performed on the shovel, firing over the half door. Ted mastered these locomotives a treat. Through Sherborne, Fred had to drop the lever over to climb the bank, and Ted said, "How's that?" The white feather was flying from the safety valves. Down through Temple Combe, up through Gillingham, and up the bank to Semley. Ted had the locomotive spot on all the way, and all the firing over the half door. From Semley it was all downhill all the way to Salisbury, more or less, and Ted had a bucket of hot water from the pet pipe ready to wash his hands as they went through Wilton South. Fred ran the train into platform 2 at Salisbury, arriving 1 minute early, and Ted took over the driving as Fred unhooked the locomotive from the train. Fred washed up as they went over the points at Salisbury East and back towards Salisbury West via the down road into the depot and screwed the locomotive down on the pit road at 4:15 a.m. Fred glanced in the firebox and she was just right for disposal. A little fire along the right hand side of the box and just dull clinker on the left hand side. Ted had come from Yeovil to Salisbury firing over the half door, and for those of you that are unfamiliar with these locomotives, they had a 10 feet straight firebox, no slope, and he didn't have to use any of the tender tools to pull through or level the fire out. Without doubt, Ted was a master craftsman firing on these locomotives. This was a brief general account where things didn't always work out as booked, with failure of the locomotive to master its load due to gradient, weather and rail conditions. The train crew and signalmen carried out their duties as laid down in the rule book regarding these circumstances. This was probably something that happened regularly at this point with the stone train empties, as when working up trains from Exeter, empty stone train wagons were noted to be berthed in Honiton incline sidings. Almost without doubt, parted from a train and placed there in similar circumstances. 30th of July 1956. Duty 444. Driver Fred Hayter, fireman Fred Johnson and guard Ted Barlow. Fred signed on duty at 1:25 a.m. and prepared their locomotive, T9 class number 30721. Off the depot at 2:25 a.m. they called out right time and proceeded to the East End yard where they were booked carriage shunting. 5 coaches to number 6 bay platform, then up over by the water tank to await the arrival of the down paper train from Waterloo, which would arrive in platform 4. When the train arrived, they made a shunt onto the back of the train and detached the rear paper van and then shunted to number 6 bay and attached. This formed the train they were going to work. Ted Barlow, their guard, came up and informed Fred's driver of the load. 6 equals 176 tonnes. Their duty was to work the 3:25 a.m. passenger and papers from Salisbury to Weymouth, as far as Wimborne, where they would detach the engine. Their signal cleared and they were given the right of way on the dot by the guard. Approaching the tunnel, they took the right-hand diversion signal, which took them across the branch at the London end of the tunnel onto the Southampton-Eastleigh line. They passed Milford Goods Yard and up the bank almost to Alderbury Junction and took the right-hand diversion signal onto the single line. There wasn't a station there, purely a junction signal box, the single line controlled by electric token. The signalman came out from his box onto a wooden platform at footplate level and handed Fred the token on the move, 10 miles an hour, and after checking it was the correct one, Fred hung it in a safe place on the locomotive. Tokens were contained in a leather pouch with a looped handle to enable exchange on the move and were clearly marked with the portion of line to which they applied. This was a nice job, just a few shovels of coal on the fire now and then, and keep the boiler between 1/2 and 3/4 full. There were a couple of small gradients, but it was mostly straightforward running. Tokens were then exchanged at Braymore, Fordingbridge and Verwood, and the last one was given up at West Moors, which was the end of the single line. However, with this early train, Verwood signal box wasn't open, so they were given a long token, as it was called, which allowed them to continue to West Moors, where they then continued their journey on double track. This long token was more of a long key shape rather than a round disc. After stopping at Wimborne, the locomotive was uncoupled and they went into the siding and coupled up to a 3-coach set. After their previous train had left, being worked through by a Bournemouth or Weymouth crew with their own locomotive, they then shunted up over the points and back into the station. Their train now formed the 5:17 a.m. from Wimborne to Bournemouth West. This was known as the early workers train, calling it all stations. The first stop was Broadstone, Not a large station, but quite an important place at the time. It was not known as a junction as such, which always seemed rather surprising to Fred, but well worth a mention at this point. They kept to the left-hand line to continue to Poole and finally Bournemouth West. A branch-off signal here would take you to Hamworthy Junction and onward to Dorchester and Weymouth, the route that our original train would have taken. And it is interesting to note that at the time, Salisbury crews didn't work to Weymouth. At Broadstone, about 40 degrees over on the right-hand side of the track, trains diverted off and onto their line from another single line which came from Blandford and Templecombe. This was called the Somerset and Dorset line, and this route was used by various passenger services, including the Pines Express, using the same line as the SR to Bournemouth West. Locomotives were turned via the triangle there, and had a small open-ended shed where crews would take water and await to drop back on their train to Bournemouth West Station for their return working. Onward with their journey, their next stop was Creekmore Halt, Poole, Parkstone, Branksome and then into Bournemouth West, a terminal station which had a falling gradient of 1 in 90, arriving at 5:45 a.m. With their small train, this was an easy turn to work, but in the summer months, with an excursion hauling 6 to 8 coaches, it was quite a steep bank to climb, especially when leaving Parkstone, which would make the locomotive cough and sputter a bit. Loads were laid down for different types of locomotives for this bank, and sometimes banker locomotives were provided to assist the train. On arrival at Bournemouth West, the shunter uncoupled the locomotive from the train, and this was removed by the shunting locomotive into the carriage sidings, which is now in the vicinity of which is now the Bournemouth Electric Depot. They then travelled light engine, tender first, round via Gasworks Junction Triangle to Bournemouth Central Station, and then back into the Motive Power Depot, situated on the west side of the station. By utilising this move, they had already turned their locomotive for their return journey. After having made the tea and had their break, at 7:15 a.m. they left the depot and crossed to the downside and back onto their train, another 3-coach set, forming the 7:42 a.m. Bournemouth Central to Salisbury. Once the signal cleared, they were given the right of way by the guard, and their first stop was Branksome. It was here they picked up Mr. Alf Parsons, chief clerk at Salisbury Motive Power Depot, who boarded this train every morning en route to work. Station stops were then Parkstone, Poole, Creekmore Halt, Broadstone, Wimborne, West Moors, where they collected the token for the single line, Verwood, Daggons Road, which was downhill running in and had no passing loop, which other single line stations had, Fordingbridge, Braymore, Downton, uphill through the tunnel, 3 possible token exchanges completed, and the final token given up at Aldbury Junction, where they joined the double line. Downhill running with route cleared past Milford Goods, Tunnel Junction and into Salisbury Platform 4, they arrived there at 9:09 a.m. The locomotive was detached and then ran light engine to the depot. Alf Parsons was given a lift. The locomotive was then berthed on the pit road. Footnote: about 6 passenger trains ran over this route daily, and in the summer season this increased with trains that ran through to Weymouth, with other excursions and through train running from the western region. Freight trains also ran over this branch to Wimborne, 1 morning turn, shunting en route, Fordingbridge being reasonably busy, an evening turn also ran to Milford Goods and Salisbury Yards. Fred has seen no previous reports of trips over this branch, and this account has been recorded to hopefully retain some of the historic nostalgia of a journey over a line which to some didn't know ever existed, let alone work trains over it, as Fred had the pleasure of doing as a fireman and driver. The line was axed and closed by Dr. Beeching. The last passenger train ran on the 2nd of May 1964.